Hello and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking with Zoë Hall, LMFT and LPCC. The books we chat about are The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life by Dr. Lisa Miller, and Of Water and the Spirit, Ritual, Magic and Initiation in the Life of an African Shaman by Malidoma Patrice Somé.
The Awakened Brain is a groundbreaking exploration of the neuroscience of spirituality and a bold new paradigm for health, healing, and resilience. Whether it's meditation or a walk in nature, reading a sacred text, or saying a prayer, there are many ways to tap into a heightened awareness. In The Awakened Brain, psychologist Dr. Miller shows you how.
When he was a young boy growing up in Burkina Faso, Malidoma Somé was taken from his village and brought to a Jesuit mission school, where he spent years being harshly indoctrinated in European ways of thought and worship. In Of Water and the Spirit, Malidoma recounts his journey home and his initiation into the healing traditions of the Dagara culture, where the natural and supernatural blend together. It was a really interesting conversation. Excellent book pairing. I thought she picked some books that really worked well together, and we talked a lot about how the spiritual world can exist with psychology and what it means to be living with an awakened brain. So, hope you enjoy.
Hello, Zoe. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We were just hoping to start out with a little bit of an intro of who are you, what are your pronouns, your license, any part of your identity you'd like to share.
I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor based in San Luis Obispo, California. And my pronouns are she and hers. I work in private practice in San Luis Obispo and see primarily adults, couples, and do some family therapy. Some work I'm actually really enjoying with adult children and their parents. It's something that I've been doing more in the last couple of years that I really enjoy.
How has that been going? Has that been a surprising sort of, I don't know, niche or finding in your own practice?
Yes, absolutely. The first few families I worked with were mothers and daughters, and there was just something so poignant and almost sacred about that work. And it has since evolved into other configurations, and I'm certainly hoping that I get to do more of it in the future because I'm finding I really enjoy working with both the adult psyche and the child psyche within the adult at the same time.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And to just that dynamic, I'm sure feels like there's always sort of something alive to work with. Yeah, that's interesting. So you're in San Luis Obispo. Do you offer telehealth or are you in person only? What's that configuration for you?
I predominantly see people in person in San Luis Obispo and also meet with people virtually. Recently, also got licensed in Wisconsin because some clients I have moved there. So I get to keep working with them. And I'm also in the process of getting licensure in Washington State so that I can also continue working with a client who recently moved. So some virtual work will be ahead for sure.
And can you tell us sort of what maybe inspired you to become a therapist?
Yeah, I think the moment I realized it was something I wanted to do was after working in hospitality as an events planner in my early 20s. And I really enjoyed supporting people, helping people. That work was a great first career. And when I left that job, which was in Philadelphia, I moved back to California. And in the process of moving back, I had the insight that I wanted to become a therapist because at the end of the day, I knew I wanted to do something that contributed a bit more than event planning and party planning, which was ultimately, it was a wonderful, great career. Ultimately, I was helping a business grow and a company accumulate wealth, and that wasn't really where my values were on a deeper level. And so it was around that time that I moved back to California that I started looking into psychology and just sort of realized, despite taking classes in college, something was different a few years later where it really landed for me that that was something I wanted to do professionally.
So Zoe and I actually met in grad school. We went through the same grad program. So it's always so fun to sort of hear where my friends and colleagues have ended up and how they've started practicing. And yeah, I'm just really happy to have you on today.
Can I ask about the switch from like event planning to going into psychology? I'm just wondering as like because I like have bartended back in my day and you find out so much when you're behind a bar because people just
Yes.
open up to you. Was that part of the event planning piece?
Yes, yes, yeah. That I think that's a really good point is people reveal themselves when they are having food and drink and planning large events. And I was just sort of I had so much exposure to so many different kinds of personalities, and there was something inherently psychological and counselor-like about supporting people in anticipation of an event. And they were really important life events too for people sometimes. So
High
just
stress.
connecting, yes, high stress and connecting with
Yeah.
them on a deep level that I found I enjoyed a lot, in addition to doing the logistical work of the job.
Nice, that's cool. And it must be, is that considered the therapist equivalent of like the highest praise if you're having to get additional licenses to keep working with people? Like it seems like such a positive. You're just like, okay, I'm gonna go out of my way and now I'm licensed in Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's such a funny thing, and I think Amanda and I have joked about it a bit. Because I got a second therapy license, I have been doing more paperwork and more dealing with the California State Board, and I find it funny that I'm continuing to do that now with other state boards that operate in different ways. And I got a second license, the LPCC license, so that I would be able to have license portability from other states. Because I feel like in 2025, it's not uncommon for people to move to different states for a variety of circumstances, particularly since the pandemic. So it just feels as though it's also a way to just be with the times in the way that people are able to relocate or even spend good amounts of time in other states for certain reasons. So,
Yeah, it's great that you do that because you've built such rapport, I guess, with your clients and like finding a therapist, getting that right fit is hard. So I can see why people would
mhm.
want to keep working with the one they've got. So is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself professionally or personally before we jump into your book picks?
I think one thing I'd like to add is that the program that Amanda and I did in San Francisco was a somatic program. So, really focused on body psychotherapy. And that's something that I bring into my practice as well. A lot of focus on nervous system regulation, polyvagal theory, things like that. And it's something that I feel very grateful for, having had that level of training. It feels sometimes like it gives me a lot of useful frameworks to consider in working with clients in a way that I might not have had if I hadn't had that particular kind of training.
I totally agree with that. And it also, I think, is such a nice transition into your books because I feel as though there is sort of an inherent spirituality to connecting to the body. And so I'd love to sort of jump into your books. And I'm so excited to talk about, we actually haven't talked much about spirituality at all on the podcast yet. And so I've been really excited for this. I like lit my candles and burned my sage and just like was like, yes, we're gonna get to kind of play and dabble in this other realm today. And I'm just so excited to talk about the books. The first book of your choosing is called The Awakened Brain by Dr. Lisa Miller. Why did you choose this book?
I chose this book because I feel that it balances and kind of straddles two topics that a lot of people tend to view as binary, naming psychology on the one side with science and academia and spirituality on the other. And because I feel there's an almost phobia of mystical things, esoteric things, spiritual things in mainstream society, I thought it could be helpful to talk about a book that uses a traditional Western framework and written by someone who has very respectable credentials academically to sort of support the Western mind in being receptive to some of what she describes in the book as she moves into the more synchronistic or spiritual experiences that she begins to have. So when I share it with clients, it feels like a soft entry into the world of spirituality and things that are more mysterious because there is so much research in the book, and people I find tend to take that in as a or have more faith in it, to use that word on purpose, have more faith in it than they might in things that are harder to understand from the logical parts of our brain.
Yeah, I could not agree more with everything you're saying. I was so surprised in a good way. I definitely trust you and your book picks and loved both of the books. And sometimes I'm like, I get a little bit nervous or I get a little bit like, is this going to be so neuroscience heavy, which I
Hmm.
do love, but in small doses. And so I have to say that I feel like she really weaved it in such a digestible way. You know, it's like part
Hmm.
memoir. She brings in the neuroscience. I just was so impressed with the book and was a little bit like, why aren't more people talking about it? And so I just have to add that. I was like, yes, like this is just, I think, such a nice resource, especially for the folks that they want to see the science and they want to understand it,
Yeah.
which I totally get. I know I touched on it a little bit, but can you give us a brief overview on sort of what the book is about?
Yes, I think digestible is such a good word to use. And there is so much, I think that's a disclaimer that should be added to. There is so much neuroscience in the book. And after having read it a second time, there are parts of it where I kind of lose connection or lose contact with the neuroscience, but I know and trust that what she's doing is thorough and rigorous in ways that might go beyond me. And I think of that too sometimes when I recommend it to clients. Is like, that's not for everybody, that level of information. But the book is about the neuroscientist, Lisa Miller, and her professional exploration of how spirituality can alleviate symptoms of depression. And she sort of describes being young in her training as a psychologist and how she starts to notice that clients who are extremely depressed or somehow unresponsive to conventional treatments, how something happens that's different and more healing for them when they start to connect in with their spiritual identity or spiritual path. And while she's explaining her professional journey, she simultaneously weaves in her personal journey of infertility with her husband and describes how she moves from what she calls the achieving brain, which is we must get pregnant, we must do IVF, this must happen, a really strong agenda, and how the difficulty of that experience actually lands her in a place where she and her husband are so down and out and so sad about their inability to conceive that she starts to notice meaningful coincidences around her that ultimately put her on a different path of parenthood than she originally expected.
I'm very curious about how you discovered this book, if you remember.
It's such a good question. I think it came up as something suggested, maybe on Audible. I'm
Ah.
not sure because that's how I first read it by listening to it. And I think I'm just so interested in this side of psychology that I now, thanks to the Hall of Mirrors that is the internet, I now get a lot of things kind of floating my way. And as an aside, that those things have floated my way, I have incorporated them into the philosophy of the book, which is I have given meaning to them as meaningful coincidence. When something resonates with me, because there's just so much content online, I get this kind of sense of something, I will usually pursue it as a form of a book or a form of media to kind of take in.
So I love that. So you are the active embodiment of someone with an awakened brain.
I love the way that sounds. Yeah, I try. I really try. And it does feel like there's a consistent pull for us humans to get dragged down into our suffering in a way that feels very narrow. So I do appreciate about this approach that it keeps my perspective open, malleable, broad. So I really do try. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of what I kind of refer to it as, like when the universe is trying to give you a little kick or something that, like, do you know, you notice things or something that will snap you out of yourself. Like, I don't know, maybe this is like a silly example, but I remember when I first moved to Canada and there was the first winter, which is always so dreadful, and it's like minus 30, which I don't know what is in Fahrenheit, but it's so cold. And I went to trivia and I was trudging home and it was so snowy and icy. And I just remember thinking, like, this is terrible. It's freezing. And as I was like feeling so sorry for myself, four people just jogged past me. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's the universe is telling me to lighten up. Just like, it's not that bad. But so that's sort of how I interpret it or how I maybe think about the awakened brain. But can you tell us, you touched on this a little bit, but what Lisa Miller kind of means by that?
Yeah, that's a really vivid image that you paint of four people jogging, just a casual jog
Smiling and
in the
like
freezing weather. Yeah.
at like two
Yeah.
in the
It's
morning.
a
I'm like,
hard
who
place.
are you?
Yeah.
It's like the news that viral news clip of that woman getting interviewed about how amazing it is to run in the snow, and like she kind of has this, it feels a little bit like arrogant air to her, and then as the couple is running away she slips and falls on air after being like it's the perfect snow, like it's just like compact, and like it's just the way she says it, and then to run away and fall, it's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah.
There might have
Side
been a
note.
lesson in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
The universe
Exactly.
trying to
Yeah.
tell you stuff, you know? So,
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. Yeah, the awakened brain is, I really appreciate how concise that phrase is and how much she captures. What she describes as the awakened brain is a mode of perception. And one of the things that she says in the book that I really like is, can we start to think of our imagination not so much as a place where we are generating what's in our imagination, but more so a receiving ground and a field of perception. And so for her, the awakened brain is one that is openly and actively engaging with the environment in a way that assumes that life, the universe, whatever you believe in, whatever you call it, is here to support you and hold you through an experience.
I love that. I just felt this wave of, yeah, there's something about receiving and not having to put the pressure on yourself to create, right? When I think, to your point, when we think about imagination, a lot of times it's like this idea of generating this world, but
Mhm.
it's like, no, can you just open yourself to that awareness to receive what's already
Yeah.
there for you?
Yeah. Absolutely. And the further I go down this path, and the more I feel interested in it and encouraged to explore it personally, the more I feel that. And it does take a lot of pressure off of decision making, stressors, to know that it's almost a fun kind of detective game to
Hmm.
go through daily life looking for signs and synchronicities. And when you put your awareness on that frequency or that channel, I've had enough mind-blowing experiences doing that that, like Lisa Miller talks about in the book, at first the mind is very closed to it and can't sort of see what's happening. And then the more synchronicities there are, the more things that happen, maybe the more suffering there is, and our defenses get weakened and we become more desperate, we become more open to believing that maybe there are forces at play that extend beyond the realm of our brains and what our brains are typically capable of. Although she argues that everybody has this capacity in a sort of inborn, innate way, which I really appreciate that part of her message quite a bit.
Yeah, I feel like that piece makes it so accessible and not like this is only for those that are actively practicing spirituality or have like this level of enlightenment to them innately. Like I'm like, oh, how beautiful to imagine all of us having this accessibility to it.
Mhm.
And also not equating spirituality equals like religious spirituality. I like off the top
Hmm.
there, you said the word faith, and that's what I always sort of think about that you kind of just respect people's faith in things, whatever they are. And like that's it's such a nice term and such a broad term that I always like to me that doesn't mean a religious faith. That's just like your faith of in something that's a little beyond yourself.
Yeah, and I think that just what you said there about religion and spirituality, even bringing in the notion of religion adds a very human charge because, like so many other things, like money or death or politics, people have this kind of contraction inside around organized religion often. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important thing that you're saying, which is we're not actually talking about religion here. We're just sort of talking about an orientation in the world in an embodied sense as we go through our day with our senses. And what are we sensing in our bodies, in our psyches? Are we letting information sort of trickle in the way that I think we are receivers, all of us, of information? And that's certainly how I hold my psychotherapy practice, which is I fully believe that clients inherently have wisdom, and I am here to support them in reconnecting with something that we all have, which is some kind of inherent healing capacity.
So this book really covers a lot around Lisa's journey into, as a neuroscientist, is that the correct phrase, I
Mhm.
guess, about her diving into depression and what she's seeing as like how spirituality affects mental health. So I'm wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of the overview about what the neuroscience says as the link between the two that she kind of discusses in this book.
Yeah, one of the things that she talks about is that our parietal lobe, which is a lobe sort of the top, little bit back part of the brain, there are observable effects in the brain when people have a sustained spiritual connection over time. And coincidentally, or not, as she would argue, those same regions of the brain are impacted with, I think she sort of says, mild to moderate depression. And so what happens neurologically is that when people have connection to spirituality, there's actually a thickening of the cortex, the tissue around the parietal lobe, and that's evident in scans. And she sort of presents it in a very excited fashion because she's looking for the science to back something that she knows intuitively, is that that thickening is thought to be something that, there are more synapses, there's more connectivity there. It is a protection against depression and, in some cases, anxiety.
It's wild. Like some of the results they're talking about, like the MRIs or like the data,
Hmm.
it was just really interesting and very eye-opening to see the direct connection around. Yeah, because I guess we put so much weight on the science of things, and you're like, it's sort of there.
I
Yeah.
also like that she focuses a lot on, I mean, her research is on young people, right? Like adolescents and young adult. And I love that this, well, I mean, that's such an active part in someone's life in terms of neuroscience and brain development and brain changes, right? And I feel like it's a cool thing to hold for people that either work with adolescents or have
Mhm.
ideas about what the teen years are, because I think that stage of life gets a kind of a bad rap. And this is like, oh, wow, no, there's a really creative, cool openness to this stage that I don't think we give enough credit to.
I'm glad you brought that up because that part of the book stands out to me a lot, where she references the research when teens have, it's either transcendent spiritual experiences or some kind of consistent spiritual practice. When that is evident in their teen years, there are effects, positive effects in the reduction of depressive symptoms for years going into their adulthood. And there's something pretty profound about that, that if there is that kind of, and I think very helpful for therapists to work with, for parents to work with, counselors, anyone engaging with a teen, that actually studies show that supporting their spiritual path and development can actually be a protective factor later in life.
So cool.
Yeah, it really is. This is the kind of information that helps me feel more confident as a clinician, bringing spirituality into the room
Hmm.
as I'm working with people who might be skeptical or cynical. And that's one of the reasons I love this book, because she just sort of hands it all over in a way that you can't really argue with what she sees if that's what the research shows.
Yeah, and in the book, I think the phrase that stood out to me around what you're saying is like spiritual hunger, like depression being spiritual hunger. But yeah, I think that's a phrase that really stood out and kind of is going back to exactly what you're saying there, that it's really something that could maybe lead to or help alleviate depression is like this lacking of spirituality.
Yeah, that is a really important phrase in the book. And I think in reflecting on that, there's something I feel sort of missing in the book about the caveat that in some cases, clinically, spirituality is not the answer, because there are certain mental health conditions and certain levels of distress that people experience. I think it's important to remember that this is certainly not meant to facilitate people into what is known commonly as spiritual bypassing. It's not meant to replace feeling your feelings, rolling your sleeves up, getting into the nitty-gritty in a real kind of tough way. This is not meant to avoid any of that. It's an added resource and an added level and layer of perception that we all have, but it's not like everything in mental health. It's not a one size fits all kind of thing.
Thanks for saying that. I think it's important to kind of name that as, can we see this as sort of like an extra cushion to maybe some other work that is also needed around, certain mental health challenges. So I appreciate you adding that in. We've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but in the book, she describes two modes of awareness, which are achieving and awakening. How would you describe these, and why do you think they're important for us to understand?
Awakening awareness is something that goes against what I think is more prevalent in our culture, which is achieving awareness. And so the achieving brain or achieving awareness is this way of relating with reality or the world, which is if I do this, I will be a good that.
Hmm.
So children are conditioned from a young age to be in achieving awareness in the school system. Citizens are conditioned to sort of achieve to be a good citizen. And there's a very linear progression, or so we think, to achieving awareness. So when people work really hard and they don't get the results that they expect, they feel disappointed or confused, because the idea is that if you put your mind to something, and in Lisa Miller's case, she practices her achieving self professionally, and you see in the book that she just makes these strides professionally. And then when she encounters infertility, she acknowledges in the book that all of her ways of moving forward in the world were driven by achieving awareness. And it didn't matter how privileged they were, how many resources they accessed, she hit a limit in terms of what her achieving awareness, which I feel is for most of us largely driven by ego. When we hit that limit, it's very confusing, upsetting, depressing. And so as she makes the transition from her achieving self, trying to apply all of that ambition and results oriented mindset to her infertility journey, she realizes that when she opens the doors of her own perception into something more mysterious, she's accessing her awakened brain, which is what she says we all have this sort of innate capacity for. And the awakened awareness, as we're talking about, is something that is more mysterious and is assuming almost that there are positive forces working to our advantage out in the world, even when we feel distress or suffering or feel like we're the victim of circumstance.
I appreciate the way she used her experience with infertility to explain this. And I feel like these sorts of like blocks that happen to us can be relatable, even if it's not someone experiencing IVF. That's such a poignant example of not being able to rely on your smarts or, yeah, just your drive to achieve something. Whereas that might be a different experience for someone else who experiences, a death of a family member at a young age or anything out of our control that you can't think your way out of or rely on your drive to succeed in. I really appreciated her weaving in her very vulnerable story around this because even if that's not your experience of infertility, I think a lot of people can relate to that. Like I've had something where I haven't been able to rely on my, achieving brain for this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another term that I liked, this book was full of like great lingo, I feel.
Would you call them little nuggets?
Yeah, I know. Little nuggets of wisdom, as I like to say, probably more than I should on the podcast. But one term that I really liked was this idea of quest orientation. And I guess I understand this as, being open, curious, and responsive to life's challenges. And a little bit of what we are just saying, not thinking you know all the answers. What are your thoughts on this?
I really think that phrase captures that sort of sleuthing state of mind that I referenced earlier. If we add that layer of perception to our daily lives, we are aware of new and different things rather than the sort of habitual thought patterns that tend to control what we think of as our personality, our values, our belief systems, and all of that. So, yeah, I think it's something that really, as you just said, Amanda, it's that added layer of something that's there that's not meant to replace any of our typical coping strategies or ways of being, but that it is a humbling orientation that presumes that we're not actually in the driver's seat as much as we think we are in daily life, in that more achieving kind of space that I think becomes just habit for a lot of people, particularly in Western society and particularly in 2025.
Yeah, there's something about having your eyes and your everything set on a goal where you become sort of rigid and narrow viewed on a lot of things you can control towards like achieving that, right? So I do think when you're in that, it's so hard to be like, let me open my awareness to these other possibilities. But I really appreciated the breakdown of the two modes because I felt like that was a good takeaway to go okay, if I take away something from this book, maybe it's, am I just seeing this one challenge in my achieving brain and am I not being open to other possibilities, right? Like even that sort of self-inquiry, I feel like is I don't know, for me, such a great takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an openness that is very different from that more contracted laser-like focus where we do, in order to kind of like execute tasks as humans, like we do have to lock in, as they say, and
Mhm.
and yet that has its own limitations if we forget that there's actually this other capacity we have to be more receptive to that other level of perception.
Hmm. Another thing that I was sort of fumbling within my mind, and a word that I think is sort of thrown around a lot, is the word integration. This idea of having a spiritual experience, and maybe that's in nature or connecting through a meditation or meditative practice, right? And having what feels like a profound spiritual experience. And then this idea of having to integrate that. I think this is a term that gets kind of thrown around a lot, because if we don't integrate the experience, then it just is an experience that's standalone and isn't anything that sort of is in our body that we can carry forward. Any advice for listeners on how to integrate more of their awakened brain experiences?
The first thing that comes to mind is talk about it. Push past the assumption that there's stigma and be vulnerable with your support system or your support network that you are having or have had experiences. It's so true that if it gets put on a shelf, it doesn't have the opportunity to sort of get incorporated and folded in to life. And I agree with what you're saying, Amanda. Integration is one of those buzzwords in therapy land that there's so much pressure and emphasis on it. And like so many other concepts, what does it actually mean truly?
Yeah.
So I think it is important to just normalize these experiences that I think people are actually already having. When people are interviewed about whether they've had any experiences of significant awe or wonder in their lives, most people say yes. Whether they would label it as spiritual or not is another question. So, because we're such meaning making machines as humans, my speculation is that people are actually already dialed in to something, though they may not label it as spiritual. So again, it's recognizing a certain level of perception and sort of realizing that we can consciously, with a sense of agency, we can move toward those things that may already be giving us a sense of transcendence, awe, wonder, that feeling that a lot of people describe that they're, around something or in a space where they know there's something bigger than just themselves. All of those things are part of this. And whether or not we call it spirituality or religion is more that sort of, that's more the trappings of language and man-made sort of notions. So I think just bringing it to the forefront of awareness in a different way is something. And when we were in grad school together, I did a project about, I think it was called something like Magic in the Mundane, because I was very interested in through daily life, how can we tap into things that are very transcendent as we're going through our mundane daily lives. And one of those ways, I think, for a lot of people is beauty, whether it's beauty of nature or in some of what that project entailed. I always feel very drawn to light and color and ways that there are certain shapes and things in my environment. And I could name that as just, oh, that's pretty, that's cool. Or am I really allowing my body to feel something? Am I tapping into something else that my senses, beyond my five senses, are allowing me to perceive and experience?
I love that. I think that it's so interesting. I always wonder that, I mean, as an example of, when you're finding art for your wall, like why do some people like this more than others? Why do we even have the urge to put things up and look at them? Or like, why do we find that so fascinating? Like Amanda, I think you sent me a picture of a photograph that's on your wall the other day. So it's kind of interesting, like the magic and the mundane of like, yeah, is the beauty or different types of colors just a way for making us feel something?
Yeah, it's all right there, exactly. And the choice of what art we use, or yeah, just there's so many things that I think are already happening for people that with putting that sort of awareness onto it, I think it does help with that integration. To go back to what you were saying, Amanda, is just bringing it in. And another way to do it is to stay with your body, because when there are certain intense spiritual experiences that people have, the energy sort of goes up in the body and it can get very ungrounded. So I think also staying in the earthly realms by remembering that you have those senses to sort of ground into can also be really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And so there's a lot in this book that a reader can take away. I think all three of us sort of picked out different things that stood out to us the most, but what would you hope a reader would take away overall from this book?
I think my biggest hope would be for a reader to be willing to consider that some of this is real and maybe try even a little bit to put it into practice. And if there is resistance to noticing what Carl Jung, the psychologist, calls synchronicity, why is there resistance? What kind of social conditioning led to that resistance? And is it possible to just let like a teeny bit of light into any of those blocks or resistance there are? So if by sharing about this book, one person begins to believe in meaningful coincidence, I will feel as though I did my job, or I shared what I came to share, because I think it's really powerful stuff. And it can be just an experience of feeling held by the universe in a way that is so comforting, even if it's not literal.
So let's jump into the second book. So the book of your choosing, which is Of Water and the Spirit by Malidoma Patrice Somé. So can you tell us why you picked this book?
Yeah, I picked this book to enhance the same idea. The author really pushes the envelope of what we would call reality. And this book sort of floated into my awareness in a way that there was something about it that resonated with me. And it was essentially like, if you're interested in spirituality, you're on a path, like this could be a book for you. And I felt something intuitive or a pull to it. And I also read it at a particularly difficult moment personally. And so some of what he goes through in the book in terms of what is sometimes called like the hero's journey, or just this kind of isolation and loneliness that can set in for people when they're struggling very deeply, that really resonated with me. And even though I am very open-minded and I have become increasingly comfortable with the idea that there is more to reality than what we assume, this book really brought me to an edge of that by some of the stuff that he describes in his initiation as a shaman. And so some of what he describes is quite literally otherworldly.
Mhm.
And yet, while I read it, I felt it to be true.
So you've touched on a little bit of the story, but if people aren't familiar at all, could you tell us what this book is about?
Yeah, this book is about a really, really interesting person, Malidoma Patrice Somé. It's his autobiography. It's about his journey growing up in a small village in Burkina Faso. And while he's growing up, he's essentially abducted by French missionaries, and he spends years living at a boarding school. He escapes the boarding school on his own, runs through the wild as a teen, I believe, returns to his village, and is a sort of encouraged by the elders to spend time in the West. I chose this book partially because he, like Lisa Miller, has educational credentials that I feel help make this more palatable to the Western mind. He has three master's degrees and two doctorates. And at some point in his process of leaving Burkina Faso, he gets his education and he comes back and he is initiated as a shaman in his village. And by then, he's already completed years in the boarding school, is exposed to Catholicism, and has also sort of grown up with a lot of indigenous wisdom in his village. And I really appreciate how he blends the two worlds he has lived in and how he talks about his role in that and how much he believes in the power of connection to nature, to ancestors, and to ritual as ways of connecting with what he feels is everybody's gift.
I was so thrilled to start this book. I had zero expectations. It's so rich, and the way he describes his journey in these places, I actually was visualizing my own idea of what that looked like. And so I was started Googling pictures of Burkina Faso because I was like, I want to get like a sense of just what this place actually looks like. And it's such a cool journey, to your point, like a hero's journey, and just blending the two worlds and how you really sort of see him struggle between the two of them. And so to me, it made like so much sense to pair these two, especially when we give sort of like the awakened and the achieving awareness, right? Perfect. But, he shares parts of his story, to your point, like initiation. At one point, in the beginning, there's a funeral for his grandfather that really like you're reading this like it almost feels like wizardry. Like you kind of question the reality of what is going on, is at least how we understand it in like Western culture. Why do you think it's so hard for many of us in the Western world to be open to like spiritual experiences?
How much time do you have?
Totally.
I have so many thoughts and feelings about this subject, and I believe that there are a lot of historical foundations to Western civilization's skepticism. Leaving religion out of it, which is part of it, but not all of it, and how certain religions decide that other practices are wrong. Putting that aside, there is so much that's happened in civilization in the last 500 years that's contributed to this. For example, when colonization became more prevalent, that kickstarted the scientific revolution. People were collecting new flora and fauna and having to catalog and organize it in ways that outdated European notions of what science and reality and nature are. So there was this sort of glorification as a result of logic and reason. And by then, obviously, there were strong religious forces associated with monarchies in Europe. And so after the scientific revolution, the Age of Enlightenment kind of brought again this emphasis on value and logic and reason and all of these things that do not have anything to do with indigenous practices, paganism, all this ancestral wisdom became devalued as science became something that turned into the gold standard of assessing reality. So I love history, and I often feel that I can recognize the downstream or trickle down effects of historical events or just the social conditioning that happened because by the time it was the 18 and 1900s, again, there was that emphasis on science, logic, reason. And Sigmund Freud, who's considered someone who is a key player in the psychology world, was so afraid of psychology being seen as mystical or unscientific that he actively moved away from things that were more mystical. And the irony of that is that the word psyche means soul. So when we talk about psychology, we're actually talking about the soul. But because of all of the factors I mentioned, he set a precedent and a strong one for applying the rigors of science to something that's actually quite a bit more mysterious and all-encompassing, which is our soul or our humanity.
I always thought like the phrase the Age of Enlightenment was kind of like so insulting to be paired along a time that was just also so cruel, like when you're talking about like just the level of colonization throughout the world. Yeah, so the balance between the two, I have always kind of thought that that was just such a juxtaposition. And
Yeah.
hearing Malidoma share like the first person narrative of like literally being taken and being forced into these schools, and yeah, it's very powerful to pair those two ideas. And he talks a lot about kind of like the idea of community and belonging as he kind of struggles to bridge the two cultures and not even like the colonized culture, but just as he, as an adult, then is living in like a almost quote unquote post-colonial world. So, what advice would you have for people who are kind of looking to gain a greater sense of belonging in the world that we live in?
Another
Yeah,
easy question.
I know, right? We're just like throwing out the easy questions.
one of the nice things about training to be a therapist is that therapists reap the benefits of the training. And one of the things that I've really valued about my clinical training is the emphasis on community and relationships as essential to our well-being. So when I work with clients and they feel lonely or isolated or cut off, one of the things that we talk about is capitalizing off of, again, what might already be right in front of you, but you're not labeling it as community. Taking advantage of the relationships that there are to a greater degree, I would say is a helpful first step. And then one that is a little bit more light would be to take advantage of what it is like living in this time, which is that you can find your people. If you know who your people are, you can find your people. And if they're not in your direct community in the town or city that you live in, it's not as rich from an embodied perspective, but it's very helpful still to find your community virtually. So one of the things that is a little bit more carefree that I like to do with clients is sort of like encouraging them to become involved in things that are not achieving brain, that are perhaps something sillier that they wish they could have done more as a child, because there are other adults out there who also want to do those things. And it's just a strange time. The hyperconnectivity with the loneliness and isolation is it's all happening simultaneously. So I think a third thing would be to bring it back to the awakened brain is to also know that there might be support around you that you can't see. And even when we're alone, or when I was reading Of Water and the Spirit last year in a particularly difficult moment personally, having that book as a resource brought me comfort. Did it replace the hug of a friend? No. Did it replace having actual community? Not at all. And there are ways to be sort of with that awakened brain and that bigger sort of awareness that I do think help reduce feelings of isolation and loneliness.
As you were speaking, I was sort of trying to go through, I almost said Rolodex. People don't say that anymore, but I guess you get it when I say that of like, what do I do to sort of connect to either a younger part of myself or a silly activity that, yeah, that would like attract either other people or community that are into that same thing. Like I felt myself going like, are all my extracurriculars for like an achieving part of me? Yeah, so it's giving me a good thing to sort of think about and chew on for a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it's like there are so many people who are getting really good at pickleball. And they're good at pickleball because they have that competitive achieving space. But what are they actually doing? They're playing. So I think a lot of people talk about how there's just this deficit of play in our adulthoods because there's so much emphasis on progress and professional growth and productivity. And so inviting play in, it's not always easy to remember that it's there, but it's one of the healthiest things we can do. And if we're holding it with that achievement brain and that sort of more rigid, narrower grip that we do as humans, we are sort of snuffing out or obscuring our ability to be with what can come with play, which is spontaneity, flow, connectedness, joy, a sense of awe and wonder in the way that when there is this sort of electricity that animates playfulness between humans, you can feel that. It's palpable.
Another aspect of this book that since I know you, I feel like you'll connect to is sort of connectivity to nature. What do you think the book teaches about the relationship between humans and nature or the sacred intelligence within the natural world?
I think his emphasis on using nature in addition to ritual and connection with ancestors, to me, it's the most direct portal or access we have to tapping into whatever is out there or within us. I think of the part of the book where as part of his initiation, he's supposed to stare at the tree for a really long time until he sees something, and his mind is trying to see something more than just the tree. I don't think we all have time for that in our daily lives. So it's not so much about, forcing anything super transcendent with nature as it is, again, in your daily life, even if you live in a city, even if you don't have a lot of green around you, what there is still a tremendous resource that you can actually use to access healing. And there's actually a lot of research out there about the effects of access or exposure to nature on depression, anxiety, and things like that. So, again, the research reinforces something that humans knew before science was even a thing.
So, a question for both of you, I guess, is as therapists, how do you balance like the scientific principles of psychology with spiritual experiences or the ideas that are in both of these books? I know you've touched on a little bit about like, the origin is more spiritual, but in your practice, how do you balance those?
I think it's a really good question because professionally, I'm at a moment where I am becoming more comfortable bringing spirituality into sessions. And I feel reluctant because I don't want to discredit myself. And so the research, again, just like the awakened brain suggests, it's sort of like the research is what makes it easier for people to sort of understand. But as I have progressed and traveled on my spiritual path, I have experienced enough that I will probably never be able to say to a client that I feel like there's this almost backlog of energy where I want to bring this in so much. And I have slowly become more brave about bringing it into sessions to see where a client is with it or how they sort of interact with this. And the more I do it, the more comfortable I get, perhaps integrating it, to use that word, Amanda, integrating it into my approach as a clinician, not just if a client is receptive, but that it's actually a way that I'm working with people. And the branch of psychology that addresses that is transpersonal psychology. And because I haven't completed any formal trainings in it, I am sometimes reluctant. But again, psychological work is spiritual work, whether you're labeling it as that or not. And so anything you do that is a quest to expand your consciousness, whether it's because you're suffering or you're just interested in self-development, it's inherently spiritual. And whether I name that to clients or not, again, is are we putting words to it? But I am very careful in sessions, of course, out of respect for people's experiences with religion or spirituality, because there can be trauma associated with that.
I would just add for me, I think, sort of an inherent part of this work where if a client is in their achieving brain, it feels natural to hold the awakened side of that because, since we're not that person, we're going to see things that they are not taking into consideration in their stories about themselves or whatever the situation is. And so I feel like there's like I don't know, a natural weaving of that just inherently within the work of saying, I'm going to hold all these other possibilities because ultimately we want what's best for our clients. And so I think there's a holding of that possibility for them.
Yeah, I think that's really well said because we are watching if there are, like you said, if there are tendencies toward the achieving brain. Not sure if you've experienced this, Amanda, but people apply that to therapy as well. And they
Oh
want to
yeah.
do therapy right, and they want to get an A in therapy. And
Yeah.
so
That's
that
me.
becomes part.
I just tell me I'm good.
I
Like, just
know.
give me
I
homework. I'll
know.
do it.
Yeah. Yeah, which makes sense because it's like, can I please just feel better too? Like,
Right.
is it as simple as if I follow the advice of my therapist or if I do X, Y, and Z, again, achieving brain, we like, of course, people will do that in the desire to suffer less. And there's something else, like you're saying, Amanda, we're holding it, whether people are conscious of it or not.
And I think we have to acknowledge too, working within as therapists, but within a capitalistic society, it makes sense that the sort of linear growth expectation would be applied to therapy because of the nature in which we are working. Right.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to like, and that's not to take away from the fact that, yes, we want everyone to be experiencing the things that they are hoping for in their therapy time. And it's natural that we would apply this sort of like, there's a step by step, a linear experience to that.
Yes, and there are so many therapy modalities that are exactly that, that therapists are supposed to follow something as if healing is linear, when I think most people know it's not.
Unfortunately, you can't just tell me how to be
I
better.
know. Just tell me what to do. Zoe, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Where can people find you online if they're interested in working with you, either locally in San Luis Obispo or, online and now in Wisconsin? Where can they find you?
You can find me on my website, zoehalltherapy.com, and also on Psychology Today. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed this conversation with you both. It's very meaningful and gratifying to me to be able to talk about something that I think about so much of the time these days, and that I feel at times I'm sort of bursting at the seams with this kind of new excitement and new knowledge because I didn't have a spiritual or particularly religious upbringing. So it's something that I came to find on my own, and the adversity that I've experienced has catapulted me exponentially forward on this path, which sort of confirms what Lisa Miller talks about, which is that the depression is a portal. And while that might not be true for everybody who's experiencing severe mental health symptoms, I do think that it's true for many of us in that we can use the adversity as a way to access expanded consciousness and connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include the links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
If you're in California and interested in working with Amanda, you can find her at amandathrockmorton.com and follow us on social. We are at Books From Your Therapist on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And you can follow me on Substack at Tara Kremen.
Happy living more in your awakened mode of awareness.
happy paying attention to the universe and the weird signs when it generally is just trying to make you laugh or something.